The title of this talk is How to Use Blender with Unreal Engine, and that is a super broad title. So there's no less than a million ways to use Blender with Unreal Engine, but we're going to talk about two specific ways that are the result of add-ons that the Epic dev team has been working on. Those two Blender add-ons are called Send to Unreal and Unreal to Rigify. And you can see that we've created them to sort of bridge a gap between Blender and Unreal that a lot of the community has faced with creating assets in Blender and getting them into Unreal in a way that is easy and ready to go for devs. And that's really the point of Send to Unreal. Unreal to Rigify is way more about scale meshes and animation and getting characters in, which has been sort of a project of mine personally for a long time, because it's always been frustrating to take a character from Unreal Engine, work on them inside of Blender, and get them back without having to jump through a lot of hoops for scale and scene size and units and all these other things. So with the advent of Blender 2.8, things have been easier, and hopefully these add-ons will be great for the community. So the first one that we're going to talk about is Send to Unreal, which I mentioned earlier is really about getting assets to Unreal Engine through Python hooks in the engine itself. So what we're doing with Send to Unreal is we're actually getting all of the FBX settings that you need and getting them to Unreal in a packaged way that makes it really easy to update that asset. First and foremost, though, because it's an add-on, you're going to add it through Blender's preferences window. And each add-on that we're going to talk about has its own set of preferences. So what I want to do is just quickly go through what the Send to Unreal preferences look like, and just talk about a few of the headings. You'll see a few here: paths, export, import, validations. And the first one that I want to sort of talk about is paths. One of the things that we've done here is that we've allowed you to basically put a path into your Blender preferences for an asset in your game in UE4. So if you want to override a mesh, whether that's static or scale, you can use the mesh folder, the animation folder, or the skeleton asset. So if you are working with scale meshes, and we'll see a video demo of this here in just a second, if you're working with scale meshes, then you're probably going to want to overwrite or update that skeleton asset because it is so important to UE4 as a tool. The next one that I kind of want to touch on is import. And you can see that there are three that are sort of selected by default: materials, textures, and animations. LODs and launch FBX import UI are not selected. LODs is for, well, LODs. You can actually model your LODs in Blender and automatically send them over in the case of like an environment asset or a static mesh, things like that. The launch FBX import UI is geared more toward scale meshes. A lot of times there are options that you want to change in that import UI, like picking a new skeleton or something like that, as opposed to the options that are offered to you on the asset itself in UE4. So if you want to force that opening on your Send to Unreal, just make sure that that is checked, and it will launch the FBX import UI. So let's take a look at a video here of Send to Unreal in action with static meshes. So this is a very simple example. You'll see the Blender default cube, which everyone knows and loves. And what's going on is that in the menu, you will have a drop-down that allows you to send to Unreal. And the add-on is going to look for a running UE4 process. And then it's going to just send that asset over based on the pathing that was in the preferences. So the cool thing about it is, though, you'll notice that the dev goes into edit mode and does a bevel on the default cube and hits the same hotkey to activate Send to Unreal, and it updates immediately in the UE4 viewport. Now, again, I kind of mentioned earlier, but I will say again, what we're doing is we're sort of packaging this up using FBX as I want to say a pipeline, but let's just say a standard format, we're not saving it to disk as you normally would and then doing the import. We're actually just piping it straight through to the Python hooks inside of UE4 that allow it to import. So we're handling the options for you. No more need to click around looking for units, no more need to worry about your scale. We have everything set up so that a scale you expect is going to be the scale you get inside of UE4. So let's move on to this next video, which is scale meshes. So here you've got Manny, our Unreal 4 mannequin, and what's going on is there's a little bit of animation applied to the calf, just rotating about the knee, and you'll see that it goes straight into UE4, and you can see the animation playing. If we want to edit that, of course, we can just, you can see that the dev raises the thigh and it adjusts and updates perfectly inside of UE4. Now, the controls that you're seeing on the mannequin on the Blender side of the screen here are Rigify controls, and we're going to get into that next. But right now, if you just want to animate joints and send it over via Send to Unreal, that is totally possible. You can move anything around FK-wise as well and send it over, and everything will work just fine. Okay, so let's jump into Unreal to Rigify. So Unreal to Rigify, like Send to Unreal, is also an add-on, as I mentioned earlier, which means you're going to be working in Blender's preferences to install it and work with it. Now, its individual preference settings are a lot simpler than Send to Unreal, and I want to just sort of go over two buttons that you need to be aware of that will be explained a little bit more in more detail as we go on. First of all, there's the Import Template button and the Export Template button. So Unreal to Rigify, or UE to Rigify, works on the idea of templating your rig so that when you bring in a scale mesh character that you want to animate with Rigify, you'll be doing some work to sort of marry those two rigs together and have bones control bones through a constraint system. And once you do that work, either as a technical animator or animator, you're going to want to save that. And that's where the export template comes in, because that template can then be sent out to outsourcers, friends, people working with you on your school project, and they can just import the template and then be ready to animate almost instantaneously. So let's talk about the Unreal to Rigify UI a little bit. If you notice, this is a close-up sort of view of Blender's 3D viewport over in the top right-hand corner where Items, Tools, View, and you'll see a UE to Rigify tab once you have the add-on loaded. And I just wanted to go through these options here in the UI. So first up is Source. And again, this will be explained in just a second in more detail. But what this is showing is the source armature that you have brought in. So when you bring a scale mesh from UE4 or Unreal Engine in general into Blender, you're going to get mesh and you're going to get bones that Blender calls an armature. So when you choose the armature that you're going to be driving with our system, that gets listed here. Now, this is coming from UE4, so you'll see that the default name for this armature is root, which is the top joint in the hierarchy inside the engine. Down from that, you'll see the template. Right now, you can see that it says Unreal Mannequin. This is where your template will be when you save it and create it for whatever your character or animal or anything happens to be. So the reason it says Unreal Mannequin is because we are providing a template for the current Unreal Mannequin so that once you get this and you start working with it, you can start animating pretty much instantaneously. The next section down is mode, and we're going to go over modes shortly. You'll see that right now this is source, which is the default mode that the tool starts in. And what that means is that your source is going to be the scale mesh that you brought in from either on disk or the engine, etc. Down below, you'll see, I'm going to skip over those two and then jump down to convert. So the convert button is what you're going to use as you do this process by hand on your own characters or models. And that is going to convert and run Rigify inside of Blender. And assuming that everything has been set up correctly, you should have an animatable character. So speaking of modes, that's what we're going to talk about next. What you're looking at here are all the different modes that are in Unreal to Rigify. And I'm going to go through each one and sort of give a little bit of background and explain what you're going to be looking at. So source we talked about earlier, that is the source FBX or scale mesh or asset from either disk or your engine that you've exported. You can see here it's the Unreal Mannequin. And as a lot of the community who uses Blender has talked about, those crazy bones sticking in and out, all based on the local rotation axes of the bones from the original rig. And so that's not really great to work with in Blender because of the way Blender handles rigging and handles bone direction with heads and tails and roll. And so that's the problem we're trying to solve. But that's what you should see when you import a character into Blender for the first time, especially if it's an Unreal character or from the marketplace. So let's move over to Edit Meta Rig. So Meta Rig is a direct reference to Rigify because that's what we're using. So if you've used Rigify inside of Blender, which I highly encourage all of you to do, you'll know that you first set up your Meta Rig or your movers and then build your rig around that to include deformation, skeletons, etc. So what this mode is in our tool is this allows you to set up Rigify's Meta Rig to match the rig or bone placement of the scale mesh that you've brought in. This has to be done first, just to make sure that you are going to have a deformation skeleton that lines up with the skeleton that you're wanting to animate. So FK to source is next. FK to source mode is really meant for bringing in existing animation and making sure that the keys on those FK joints are going to be able to drive the controls of the Rigify rig, because that's what you want to do. You want to be able to take animation on those, bake it to the Rigify rig, and then alter it to your whims. If you need to change leg position, change upper body pose, things like that, that's where you're going to do that. But you have to go through this mode and set up the relationship between these joints and controls before that will work. Jumping over to source to deform, what this does is this sets up the relationship between the skeleton that you've imported and the deformation skeleton that Rigify uses. You may or may not know, all depending on your experience with Rigify, but when Rigify runs, it creates this meta rig skeleton that then is used to create a couple of other skeletons that all have different purposes. So if we want to bring FK animation in, like in FK to source, and have it on the controls, we have to work with a different skeleton within Rigify. And if we want to create a deformation skeleton to match our scale mesh and animate it with Rigify, that's also a different skeleton. And then finally, let's talk about control. So control is sort of the final end result. What this is this is the Rigify rig controls that you see there, and they are married to the FK joints of the skeleton or scale mesh that you brought in and allow you to animate them at will. So let's get under the hood here with Unreal to Rigify and talk about a few other things, namely bone remapping. So what's going on under the hood is that you have one skeleton, and then you have, in the case of Rigify, multiple other skeletons. And the intention is that we create a layer of constraints, some cospatial, some not, through the constraint system in Blender, as well as just plain old parenting, to set up a hierarchy that allows the controls in Rigify to drive the skeleton that you've brought in. Now, there are a lot of ways to do that, but the way that we've chosen to do that is through nodes in the node graph. So you'll notice when you go to choose your viewport or tool that you're going to use, once you've loaded the add-on Unreal to Rigify, you're going to see a new one, and that's called Bone Remapping Nodes, and that's what we're going to get into next. Let's take a look at what these node trees actually look like. So this process is going to basically load two different node trees based on the mode that you choose that we discussed earlier. So let's say that you choose FK to source. If you then move over to your bone remapping node window and choose your bone remapping node, you'll see that you have one for FK to source. If you then move on to source to deform, you're going to see the same thing listed, a different node tree, because again, with Rigify, those multiple skeletons are going to give you different joints to hook up based on the mode that you're in and what you're trying to accomplish with the character. So I know all these nodes are a little bit hard to see, but I do have a section of it blown up so that you can see a little bit more in detail. And it's also a little bit of a preview for what we're going to see a little bit later. So the idea here is that this allows you to, in a very visual way, sort of marry one bone to a control, and you can design it out how you like. If you notice too, on the left in the smaller versions of the nodes, you can see that you can actually stack these up almost like a character, so that your mapping can actually be designed to look like a character that you've brought in. We also support being able to put a frame around these and label them for ease of use, as well as grouping, ordering, searching, things like that. So this is really where the brains are for Unreal to Rigify. This is what is setting up the relationship between the constraints and the controls and the joints on the character that you bring in that allow you to do the animation that you need to do for your game. So let's take a look at some of the results of Unreal to Rigify. On screen left, you'll notice that, again, it's Manny, the Unreal mannequin, and he has been hooked up to the controls for Rigify and animated. You can see how crazy you can get with it. And of course, with Send to Unreal, you can send this directly to Unreal and have a brand new animation in your game for your character. On screen right, you can see that you are looking at mocap animation or an idle animation brought in and hooked up to the control structure of Rigify as well. Now, there's no geo displayed here because I wanted to make sure that you could see the controls moving. But as you see, you can bring in that and then bake it down and animate it and make any alterations to the mocap or animation that you need to make. One of the things that I do like to stress at this point, though, is that we are relying on Rigify, and the reason why is because it comes with a vanilla cut of Blender. It is the sort of standard included way to build a rig and animate a character in Blender, and we want to make sure that we support that. Also, given the flexibility that we talked about earlier with node trees and remapping, it doesn't have to be this character or a character from the engine. If you want to bring in characters that you've created independently, you can do that as well. This is completely agnostic to that. This is only a way to sort of marry one rig to another via the controls of Rigify. So as you can see here, and sort of what I mentioned a little bit earlier, Rigify is not just for mannequins. So what you're looking at here is a deer that was brought in from the Animal Variety Pack on the UE4 Marketplace and set up through our system, through UE to Rigify, and animated from scratch in Blender to have a walk cycle, and then sent to Unreal, sent it right in. And this is what the result is. Now, there is a bit of setup work, like I said, and the other thing to note here is that we are using Rigify's quadruped skeleton. So any of the templates, and I say templates lightly, meaning Rigify templates or Rigify starter rigs, meta rigs that come with Blender are viable to use in this system. This started with the quadruped and was able to be used pretty much immediately without many changes in our system. Like I mentioned earlier, we've been working on this internally, and we're all Blender fans, and we've sort of shown snippets of this to the community through various Unreal Engine Twitch streams. And the overarching question we always get is when can I get a hold of this? How can I test this? When can I get a hold of this? I want it so bad. And that makes me very happy that the community has this interest. So when is the question? When can you get a hold of this? Well, I would like to announce that you can have it right now. Epic is using this opportunity to say that we are releasing these two add-ons to the community, and they are available right now. You will be able to go and download them and use them on your projects, and I cannot wait to see what everyone does with this technology. This has been a crazy, amazing opportunity to work with Blender and Unreal Engine and make these two things work even easier together. And I think it's an amazing set of tools, and you guys can have them right now. Here's the information everyone's been waiting for. Please go and get the tools, use them, and create something epic. I can't wait to see what you guys make with these tools. It's been such a pleasure to make them. Thank you so much for listening to my talk. I'm so glad that everyone in the community has enjoyed the development of everything that I've talked about today with these two add-ons. And I just want to say thank you one more time for hanging out and listening to me. Thank you.